The critical question in the West today is, can freedom survive where virtue isn't able to flourish? My talk today is based on a question that I will pose to you right at the outset. Lewis dealt with this. He dealt with this most effectively. The critical question in the West today is, can freedom survive where virtue isn't able to flourish? Is the flourishing of virtue necessary for the survival of freedom? It's a critical question.
Hi, I'm John Stonestreet, and welcome to this week's 2-Minute Warning. Actually, this week we're going to introduce the last series of 2-minute warnings that Chuck Colson was working on, and it reveals something that he cared deeply about, and that is the issue of virtue. Very pleased here to have Dr. Timothy George, the Dean of Beeson Divinity School. And we're talking here about the idea of virtue, and that's a new concept for a lot of evangelicals, a lot of Christians, because we've actually replaced the language of virtue with the language of values. And so we talk about needing to get back to Christian values in our culture, losing values and that sort of thing. But virtue is a different sort of concept because values have been so thoroughly relativized from this belief system or that belief system. But when we talk about virtue, we're talking about something that is at the core of the human experience.
Yeah, John, virtue, as we think about it today, it isn't just a set of rules and regulations. It's more like the word ethos. It has to do with a way of life. It has to do with a disposition of the sentiment. And it really goes back to a very early understanding in human culture, in classical times, of the human being shaped or formed for the kind of action in the world that really is intended to be done by the thing itself. St. Augustine put it this way: it is the ordinate condition of the affections in which every object is accorded the kind and degree of love that is appropriate to it.
So we're talking about kind of the order of our lives. And of course, one of the guys who has written one of the classic essays on this is C.S. Lewis. And I think that it's so telling because the idea of classical understandings of education was to produce a virtuous person rather than just to get a job. And Lewis, in his great article called Men Without Chest, which of course is the opening article of a book called Abolition of Man, talks about this shift that he sees in the British educational system. And the end of that article describes the problem. He says, we make men without chest and expect of them virtue and enterprise. We mock honor and are shocked to find traitors in our midst. We castrate and we bid the geldings be fruitful. I mean, that's some of Lewis's best writing.
Yeah. This book, The Abolition of Man, I first read when I was an undergraduate in school, just beginning to understand Lewis and the whole philosophy of life that he was putting forth. And this concept, men without chest, the idea is, as Lewis says, the head rules the belly through the chest. Now, if we were only head, we would be some kind of independent thinking substance. If we were only a belly, then it's just animal instincts. But between the head and the belly, there is the chest. What is the chest as Lewis understands it? Well, it is that indispensable liaison between the cerebral and the visceral. It is that which gives us formation and virtue in everything we do. And without this, he says we have atrophied chest now because we've so emphasized the intellectual part or the visceral part that we've neglected this personal, virtuous formation. And we see the results all around us in the world today.
Well, it's what our friend Mike Miller at the ACT Institute says about the belly and the head, that the belly is like the 800-pound gorilla saying, feed me, and the head is like the 80-pound professor saying, Aristotle once argued that, and the gorilla is always going to win unless we have this well-formed conscience, this well-formed, it's what Edmund Burke called a moral imagination. It's not only the understanding of what's right to do all the time. It's the instinct to do what's right that's created through habits and so many other things. And what's huge about this idea of virtue is what happens when virtue leaves society. What happens in a life when virtue goes away? What happens in a culture when virtue goes out the door? And it's the classic line from the book of Judges. This is what happens when everyone does what's right in their own eyes.
And we see the result about us in the kind of narcissism that is a part of our culture today, The me generation, we talk a lot about that, where there is no mooring, there is no foundation. And the results about us are really not just disorder, but chaos at a subliminal level. You mentioned the word habit a moment ago. One of the great books, I think, of the last generation by Robert Bellah, the sociologist of religion, Habits of the Heart. And that's what C.S. Lewis had in mind when he was talking about the chest, these habits of the heart that form us into the kind of person who does the right thing because it is the right thing. And because there is an instinct, a habit that has been trained and formed in the virtuous life to act in this particular way.
And you know, in Western civilization, there was this understanding that these virtues were not opinions. They weren't just gut kind of emotions, but they were actually rooted in the way things actually were. That these things were actually, in Schaeffer's word, true with a capital T.
Yeah, Lewis gives this example of the poet Coleridge standing and looking at a beautiful waterfall, and he said, this is sublime. But the tourist who was there with him said, oh, this is pretty. And so the difference between a waterfall being sublime and evoking that kind of reaction, which is in conformity to the thing itself, rather than simply looking upon it as a kind of banal, pretty observation. That's the difference between virtue, which is grounded in reality, and the sort of common values that just depend on our subjective thinking and feeling.
Well, over the next 7 weeks here on the 2-Minute Warning, we're going to talk about virtues that have always been considered to be absolute, the sort of things that we need to habituate into our chest, we could say. And some of these are considered cardinal virtues, and then there are the 3 theological virtues. The 4 cardinal virtues that we're going to talk about are courage, temperance, prudence, and justice. And then we'll close the series talking about the 3 theological virtues that we read about in 1 Corinthians 13. And that, of course, is faith, hope, and the greatest of these, of course, love. Stay tuned to the 2-Minute Warning.
And of course, you and I know that politics is nothing but an expression of culture. So where are we as a church to be concerned? We're to be terribly concerned with bringing Christian truth to bear in all of culture. Again, something Lewis talked about repeatedly, so that we can govern ourselves, so that there is a sense of virtue among the people, so that we can behave responsibly.